The room fell silent. Buckingham Palace, a place that had seen centuries of pomp and ceremony, now held a tension so thick it could have been cut with a knife. Prince William held a sealed envelope, its edges crisp, marked with elegant handwriting, for the family's eyes only. Cameras were barred from the room, staff held their breath, and all eyes, royal and otherwise, were fixed on the unfolding drama. In that instant, the world outside the palace walls had no idea that history was being made. And yet, within minutes, the events that were about to unfold would send shockwaves that reached far beyond the gilded halls, shaking the foundations of one of the most famous families on earth. What could be inside such an envelope that even the Queen herself had insisted remain private until this very moment? The answer, sources say, would make Prince Harry and Meghan Markle tremble. It would force them to confront words written in the Queen's own hand, words that were as unforgiving as they were deeply personal. According to insiders, the envelope contained handwritten notes that the Queen penned after the Oprah interview, calling Meghan's words deliberately cruel and deeply false. But the letters did not merely express disappointment. They revealed a fracture that had never truly healed, a rift the Queen had carried silently through her final months, one that now, in her last will, could not remain hidden. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Imagine the tension in that room. William, the future king, standing poised, reading aloud letters that spoke directly to Meghan, detailing a betrayal that the world had never seen before. Meghan, sitting rigidly beside Harry, her face carefully composed, yet behind her eyes, an undeniable flicker of fear and disbelief. And Harry, ever protective, torn between defending his wife and acknowledging the harsh reality that the Queen's private judgment had always been just beneath the surface. This was more than a will. This was a reckoning. The Queen's Oprah interview response, as detailed in these private letters, painted a stark picture. She did not merely feel hurt. She felt manipulated. The letters describe a sense of shock and betrayal, an incredulity that someone she had welcomed so warmly into her family could publicly distort the intimate truths of their private lives. How could Meghan have spoken with such certainty about things the Queen had kept sacred, only to twist them for public consumption? The words reportedly scrawled on the letter are chilling. There are truths that belong to family alone. To speak of them publicly, in such a manner, is not just unkind, it is deeply false. The secrecy of the envelope had been meticulously maintained. According to palace insiders, it had been locked away in the Queen's private study, accessible only to William and the royal executors. Its existence was known to only a handful of senior aides, and even they did not know its contents. To understand the weight of this moment, consider this. In a family whose every word is scrutinized, where loyalty and discretion are demanded above all else, an envelope like this is not merely a letter, it is a final judgment. A verdict from the matriarch that had ruled over generations of a family whose influence reaches far beyond the United Kingdom. And now, it was being read aloud for the first time. Why does this matter? Because the public perception of Meghan Markle and Prince Harry has always been carefully curated, a narrative that the couple has spent years shaping. Their interviews, public statements, and memoirs have painted them as outsiders who were misunderstood, mistreated, and even victimized. But the Queen's private letters, as revealed in this sealed envelope, threatened to overturn that narrative entirely. If what insiders say is true, the Queen had not forgiven Meghan. And in a family where public perception is intertwined with legacy, such disapproval carries consequences that extend far beyond mere sentiment. Consider the implications. Every word written by the Queen is historically significant. She had spent decades cultivating the monarchy's image, protecting its traditions, and ensuring that the family's legacy remained untarnished. That she would take the time, in her final months, to write a personal, handwritten letter criticizing a family member speaks volumes. This is not just an emotional outburst. This is a carefully considered, deliberate expression of disapproval. And it was preserved for posterity, sealed away, only to be revealed at the moment that could do the most damage. For Harry, the impact was devastating. Sources suggest that he had anticipated some level of disapproval from the Queen. After all, navigating the monarchy is never simple, and his marriage had always been unconventional by royal standards. Yet, to hear the Queen's private words, words that suggested a profound and personal sense of betrayal, reportedly shook him to his core. The prince, who has often been described as both fiercely loyal and deeply emotional, reportedly struggled to maintain composure as William read aloud passages that questioned Meghan's integrity and intentions. Can you imagine the psychological weight of hearing your spouse's loyalty publicly questioned by someone you revere and respect? The tension in the room was palpable. And then there was Meghan, always poised, always media-savvy, and capable of maintaining an unflappable exterior. She reportedly struggled to conceal her reaction. Sources describe a subtle tremor in her hands, a barely perceptible narrowing of her eyes, the slightest pause in her breathing as William's voice carried the Queen's words across the room. For a woman who has faced the global media's relentless scrutiny, the sting of private condemnation, revealed in a way that no PR strategy could mitigate, was reportedly devastating. How does one reconcile the narrative they have presented to the world with the reality of private family judgment? It is a question that even the most seasoned public figures might struggle to answer. The Queen's perspective, as described in these letters, was remarkably specific. It was not abstract disappointment. It was a pointed, personal critique. She reportedly addressed not only the public statements made in interviews, but also subtle behaviors and choices she felt were manipulative or deliberately misleading. In one passage, she reportedly wrote, "Words spoken in private should remain sacred. To distort them publicly is a cruelty no family should endure." These were not the words of a woman merely hurt by gossip. They were the words of a matriarch demanding accountability, insisting that the sacred bonds of family not be violated for public spectacle. Yet, even amidst the shock, there was a layer of irony. The very individuals who had built careers on public perception, the careful crafting of image and narrative, found themselves unprepared for the raw power of handwritten truth. The Queen's letters were not filtered through lawyers, publicists, or media advisors. They were direct, unvarnished, personal, the kind of communication that leaves no room for spin. And as they were read aloud, the gap between public persona and private reality became undeniable. Audience, you might be wondering, what exactly did these letters say? While every word is not public, insiders hint at passages that are scathing, yet dignified, a careful balance of critique and reflection. The Queen reportedly expressed sorrow that trust had been broken, disappointment that the family had been publicly misrepresented, and frustration at the way private grievances had become global spectacle. She reportedly emphasized the importance of family cohesion and the pain caused when that cohesion is disrupted for personal gain or public attention. And so, as Prince William carefully read aloud each line, the atmosphere reportedly shifted with every syllable. Harry's jaw clenched. Meghan's composure wavered. William's expression remained solemn, almost sorrowful, as he fulfilled the duty entrusted to him. Every phrase revealed more than mere disappointment. It revealed history, legacy, and an unspoken ultimatum. To the world outside, this was merely a royal reading. To those present, it was a moment of reckoning, one that would resonate for years to come. Yet, the drama did not end with the letters themselves. There were questions about inheritance, privileges, and future standing within the monarchy. Could Harry and Meghan continue to operate outside the traditional structures while still maintaining royal favor? Would the Queen's words, now public knowledge and leaks and whispers, alter the couple's strategy or approach to their own public lives? The possibilities were both myriad and alarming. And in true royal fashion, secrecy remained paramount. Only a select few knew the full content, and even they were bound by an unbreakable code of discretion. But perhaps the most fascinating aspect of this story is the human element. Beyond titles, palaces, and public image, this is a tale of family, betrayal, loyalty, love, and disappointment intertwined in a web that only centuries of monarchy could weave. And for viewers at home, it raises questions that are universally relatable. How do we handle betrayal from those closest to us? What happens when private grievances are exposed to the world? And, crucially, how do we reconcile the image we present with the truths we hold within? As the reading concluded, one thing became clear. The Queen's final act was not merely to distribute wealth or dictate titles. It was to make a statement. One final, indelible mark on the family she had dedicated her life to leading. For Harry and Meghan, this moment was not just a personal confrontation. It was a public reckoning, a mirror held up to both their private choices and their public personas. And the consequences, insiders say, are only beginning to unfold. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. No one could have predicted the weight that would settle over Buckingham Palace that day. The halls, usually echoing with ceremonial footsteps, whispered with tension. The Queen's will was being read, not by a lawyer, not by an external executor, but by Prince William himself. And at the center of it all lay a small, sealed envelope, marked with a delicate, almost imperceptible script, for the family's eyes only. A simple line on paper, yet heavy with centuries of legacy, expectation, and judgment. The very walls seemed to hold their breath, as if the palace itself understood the gravity of the moment. From the moment William lifted the envelope, an invisible current of unease rippled through the room. Staff who had served the family for decades held their positions rigidly, eyes darting to each other, silently communicating the enormity of what was about to unfold. No one spoke. Not a single camera lens, not a note of whispered speculation, would capture what came next. This was history in its purest, most intimate form, raw family truth exposed in a room designed to contain protocol and decorum. Prince Harry, usually composed in public, sat rigid. He had always been the son who balanced loyalty with rebellion, the one willing to defy expectations when he believed it necessary. Yet today, the weight of centuries of family tradition, the words of his grandmother, the Queen herself, felt almost physical in their force. Beside him, Meghan Markle maintained a controlled exterior, hands folded neatly in her lap, but insiders say a flicker of doubt crossed her face, just a whisper of what lay beneath. The envelope, resting in William's hands, was more than paper. It was judgment, history, and a mirror reflecting choices and consequences that no one could escape. As William began reading, a hush fell over the room. Every syllable seemed to reverberate through the ornate chambers, punctuated by the quiet rustle of paper. The Queen's words, carried through her handwriting and preserved meticulously over months, were not the simple formalities one might expect in a will. These were messages of judgment, disappointment, and stark reflection. She had written about the Oprah interview, about public misrepresentations, about words that she felt were deliberately cruel and deeply false. The letters were more than a critique. They were a legacy of truth that only the family could witness. The tension was almost unbearable. You could feel it in the room, could see it in the slight shifts of Harry's posture, in the micro-expressions Meghan tried so hard to hide. It was a scene reminiscent of a royal drama played out over centuries, yet with stakes that felt unprecedented. The envelope, small and unassuming, carried a verdict that transcended money, property, or titles. It was the Queen's final voice on a relationship she had guarded, and perhaps never truly accepted. William's delivery was calm, yet heavy with purpose. Every pause, every inflection, carried weight. This was not just reading a document. It was interpreting history, mediating a private truth that could reshape public perception. Insiders suggest that the Queen's phrasing was deliberate, carefully crafted to ensure that the words could not be misinterpreted. There was sorrow, but also firmness, a mixture that left the listeners in a state of suspended disbelief. Could someone so beloved, so venerated, truly feel this way about a family member? The letters suggested she did. And then, the room's quiet was punctuated by subtle but telling gestures. Staff exchanged glances, some subtly shaking their heads, others gripping the edges of their chairs as if bracing for impact. These were people who had seen decades of royal upheaval, who understood nuance in every movement, every glance. Yet even they seemed to be holding their breath, waiting for what would come next. The very air felt charged, as though centuries of tradition had crystallized into a single, tense moment. Harry's eyes, usually lively, now held something heavier, a mix of shock, sorrow, and the faint glimmer of defensiveness. Meghan's carefully curated composure was cracking in ways imperceptible to most, but not to those who had trained themselves to read every flicker of royal expression. It was as if the very act of hearing the Queen's private words, now voiced aloud, was unraveling layers of confidence and control that she had carefully maintained in public. For the first time, she appeared vulnerable, not in a staged, media-friendly way, but in a raw, private human way. The room felt suspended in time as William turned the pages, revealing snippets of a private life that the public had never been privy to. He read passages that spoke of hurt, disappointment, and the delicate fractures of trust within a family bound as much by duty as by blood. Each line seemed carefully measured, yet loaded with emotional impact. The Queen had not written out of anger. She had written out of a sense of responsibility, to preserve not just the monarchy's image, but the integrity of her family's private truth. Observers would later describe Harry as visibly unsettled, shifting in his seat, attempting to reconcile the public image of his wife with the private critique now unfolding. Meghan, often confident in her control of narrative, reportedly bit her lip and averted her gaze, a silent signal of recognition. The Queen's words were final, and no amount of public defense could erase them. William, on the other hand, maintained a composed demeanor, aware that he was now the conduit of history, the reader of truths that would reverberate far beyond the walls of the palace. And yet, even as the letters were read, the room contained contradictions. While the Queen's disappointment was evident, there was also an undercurrent of sorrow, a reflection of her role as matriarch, of the difficulty in balancing love with judgment. These letters were not merely condemnations. They were intricate, layered documents reflecting a lifetime of observation, experience, and expectation. They captured both affection and disapproval, admiration and frustration, a delicate, almost surgical, articulation of emotion that few outsiders could ever comprehend. Audience, consider this. What would it feel like to hear someone you revered, someone whose opinion shaped your life and public image, articulate disappointment in such precise terms? How do you process judgment that is at once personal, historical, and unalterable? And yet, that is exactly what Harry and Meghan faced in that palace room. The letters were not just historical artifacts. They were a reckoning. The atmosphere reportedly intensified when William reached a particular passage, one that underscored the perceived gap between public performance and private truth. The Queen allegedly commented on the dissonance between what was presented to the world and what had been privately shared within the family. The words, "read aloud," hung in the air like a tangible weight, prompting subtle but unmistakable reactions from the couple. A furrowed brow, a tightening of the jaw, a hand nervously touching a knee. These were the micro-expressions of shock and unease that conveyed volumes without a single word being spoken. As William finished reading the first envelope, the room was silent for a long moment. Not one person dared to break it. The Queen's words had struck at the heart of the family dynamic, exposing vulnerabilities, loyalties, and fractures that had long been hidden beneath the polished surface of royal protocol. It was a reminder that even in families as renowned as the Windsors, private truths have the power to redefine relationships, influence decisions, and alter destinies. And yet, for all the gravity of that moment, it was merely the beginning. The envelope had revealed the Queen's initial judgments, her critiques, her observations, but what was still to come would reportedly leave Harry and Meghan reeling. Sources hint at further passages, more pointed commentary, and directives that went beyond personal criticism into matters of legacy, privileges, and public responsibility. These were not just letters. They were the Queen's final words on a relationship she had nurtured, challenged, and, ultimately, judged. The palace staff, who had long been witnesses to private family tensions, reportedly described the scene as unlike anything they had ever experienced. Every gesture, every pause, every inflection carried weight. It was as though the room itself had become a living repository of history, memory, and judgment. For Harry and Meghan, the reading was more than a ceremonial obligation. It was a confrontation with legacy, authority, and the inescapable truth of family. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. The envelope had already caused a ripple of tension, but what came next pushed the room into uncharted territory. Prince William carefully unfolded the letter inside, the paper slightly worn at the edges, as though it had been handled many times before. The handwriting, unmistakably the Queen's, was precise and deliberate, each loop and line reflecting not just style, but the meticulous mind of a woman who had ruled a nation with steady hand for decades. But now, this handwriting carried something far weightier than commands or ceremonial instructions. It carried judgment. It was not the language of polite rebuke. It was raw, unflinching, and deeply personal. Insiders described the words as a surgical dissection of behavior, choices, and consequences. The Queen's thoughts on Meghan Markle were laid bare in lines that were simultaneously dignified and devastating. Deliberately cruel and deeply false, one line read, reportedly in reference to the Oprah interview. But the letters did more than critique. They exposed the emotional undercurrents that had been simmering for years, hidden from public view but understood intimately by those in the room. The shock was immediate. Harry's face paled. Meghan's composed exterior cracked for just a fraction of a second, enough for the palace aides to notice the subtle tension in her hands. William's expression remained calm, almost mournful, as he continued reading aloud, his voice steady yet heavy with the responsibility of being the family's messenger. Every word seemed to echo through the gilded halls, bouncing off portraits of past monarchs who had navigated scandals, betrayals, and power struggles. The weight of legacy was not lost on anyone present. The letter reportedly did not mince words. It recounted private family moments, contrasting them with public narratives that had become increasingly hostile and sensationalized. The Queen allegedly referenced conversations that had taken place behind closed doors, moments of vulnerability and trust that had been disregarded, misrepresented, or twisted for a global audience. To hear them articulated aloud was jarring. Suddenly, the carefully curated public persona of Meghan and Harry was being scrutinized against the backdrop of intimate family truths. The tone of the letter reportedly shifted between sorrow and firm reprimand. One paragraph, according to insiders, expressed disappointment that the couple had allowed grievances to spill into the public domain rather than seeking resolution within the family. Another paragraph highlighted the contrast between the couple's self-perception and the reality observed by those closest to them. Trust is earned, not performed, one line read. It was as if the Queen had distilled decades of observation into a concise, unflinching verdict, one that laid bare perceived missteps without compromise. The emotional impact on Harry was profound. Known for his loyalty and sensitivity, he reportedly struggled to process the weight of these words in real time. The Queen's criticisms were not abstract. They were deeply personal, touching on the very heart of his marriage, his decisions, and his public image. For a man who had spent years defending his family while forging his own path, this moment was almost unbearable. Each line felt like a mirror held up to choices he had made, actions he had taken, and statements he had believed were justified. Meghan's reaction was equally telling. While she had long been adept at managing public perception, this confrontation with private judgment, delivered in a room where every nuance was amplified, was reportedly destabilizing. A slight narrowing of the eyes, a brief tightening of her lips, the subtle tension in her posture. These were the visible signs of someone grappling with words that cut deeper than any media critique could. Even a practiced facade could not fully shield her from the impact of the Queen's handwritten assessments. William's reading continued, revealing additional layers of the Queen's perspective. She reportedly addressed the discrepancy between public statements and private truth, emphasizing the importance of family cohesion and the pain caused when trust is broken. The letters highlighted the consequences of public misrepresentation, suggesting that actions taken outside the protective bounds of family trust carried ramifications far beyond the moment. Every word reinforced the idea that monarchy is not merely about titles or ceremonies. It is about legacy, perception, and the delicate web of private truths that underpin public authority. The room reportedly held a tension so thick that it was almost tactile. Staff and aides, who had long been accustomed to witnessing subtle family conflicts, described the atmosphere as unprecedented. The combination of raw emotion, historical significance, and private judgment created a scenario unlike anything they had ever experienced. The Queen's letters, they realized, were not just personal reflections. They were instruments of legacy, crafted to endure, interpreted through the eyes of history, and now being mediated by her eldest grandson, the future king. Audience, consider this. What does it mean when a matriarch, A woman who has wielded power over nations and generations chooses to document her disapproval in such a precise and deliberate manner? How would you respond if someone whose opinion you have revered for your entire life not only expressed disappointment, but framed it in a way that highlights perceived missteps, inconsistencies, and breaches of trust? For Harry and Meghan, the answer was evident in the room. The combination of shame, shock, and the sudden realization that private truths could not be escaped. As the reading progressed, William reportedly paused occasionally, allowing the weight of the words to settle. These pauses were deliberate, giving the room a moment to absorb the significance. It was as if each word carried its own gravity, bending the very air around it. Observers later noted that these moments were charged with almost palpable emotion, each pause amplifying the tension and underscoring the gravity of the content. Insiders suggest that certain passages were particularly devastating, touching on personal decisions, public appearances, and media strategies that the Queen allegedly viewed as manipulative. While specific wording remains confidential, sources indicate that the critique was layered, combining sorrow, frustration, and measured admonishment. The letters reportedly did not attack Meghan as a person, but questioned choices and behaviors in a way that was both intimate and public by implication. The subtlety and precision made the critique far more piercing than any overt condemnation could have been. Harry's demeanor reportedly shifted as the reading continued. While he has always been known for his emotional intelligence and composure, the Queen's words reportedly challenged him to confront truths he had long avoided. Meghan, similarly, faced the delicate task of reconciling her public narrative with the private realities articulated in the letters. The tension between public persona and private judgment had never been more acute, and it set the stage for a confrontation whose implications would ripple far beyond that room. Even the aides and staff, typically trained to remain impartial, felt the weight of what was being revealed. Every glance, every subtle reaction from the couple spoke volumes. It was not just the words themselves. It was the confirmation of long-held suspicions, the validation of private doubts, and the stark reminder that legacy carries consequences beyond immediate perception. The Queen's letters, sealed for years and now read aloud, had transformed a ceremonial reading into a moment of historic reckoning. By the time William reached the final paragraphs of the first letter, a strange mix of emotions had settled over the room. Disbelief, sorrow, tension, and a quiet, reverent acknowledgement of history in motion. The letters had achieved their intended effect. They had commanded attention, demanded reflection, and left the audience grappling with truths that were simultaneously personal and historic. Harry and Meghan, now fully aware of the Queen's private judgments, were faced with a new reality. Reconciliation, at least in its simplest form, would not be immediate, and the world would watch every step they took next. And yet, even as the room absorbed the weight of the letter, one truth remained. This was only the beginning. The envelope held more than just a critique. It reportedly contained insights, warnings, and directives that could redefine privileges, public standing, and personal dynamics within the royal family. The implications of what was yet to be revealed would ripple far beyond this reading, challenging assumptions, shaking allegiances, and setting the stage for future confrontations. But what came next? The second letter, hidden directives, and the Queen's most pointed private warnings, would push Harry and Meghan further than they had ever imagined. And when that next revelation was read aloud, it reportedly left the couple grappling with truths that would reverberate for years to come. The Oprah interview. Just the mention of it sent a ripple of unease through Buckingham Palace long before any letters were ever opened. For many, it was a moment of spectacle, a media event watched by millions around the globe. But behind palace doors, it was something else entirely, a fracture line, exposed in public, that no amount of damage control could fully mend. And now, as Prince William read aloud the Queen's private letters, the full weight of that fracture was made painfully clear. The Queen's words reportedly conveyed a mixture of disbelief and sorrow, as if she could hardly fathom that a family member she had welcomed so wholeheartedly could publicly speak in ways she found misleading, manipulative, and profoundly hurtful. The letters, sources say, called Meghan's interview statements deliberately cruel and deeply false, framing them not as simple missteps, but as actions that had a tangible impact on familial bonds. To the Queen, the Oprah interview wasn't just a media moment. It was a breach of trust, a violation of the sacred privacy of the royal family. Audience, consider this. When someone you love and respect publicly distorts the truths you hold dear, what is your first reaction? Anger? Shock? Disbelief? For the Queen, it appears it was all of these, compounded by decades of experience managing not just a monarchy, but a family whose every word, gesture, and choice is scrutinized by billions worldwide. She had seen scandals before, political missteps, financial controversies, public fallouts, but nothing, sources suggest, prepared her for the depth of disillusionment she felt in the wake of this particular interview. The letters reportedly described private conversations that the Queen had had with both Harry and Meghan before the Oprah interview. In these moments, she allegedly offered guidance, counsel, and gentle admonitions, hoping that private dialogue could prevent public spectacle. Yet, according to insiders, those cautions were disregarded. The letters detailed a clear narrative. The Queen felt blindsided, hurt, and misrepresented. For a woman who had spent her life mediating complex family dynamics with a mixture of authority and compassion, this was not a betrayal she could easily overlook. Harry's reaction in the room was reportedly one of profound internal conflict. Known for his deep loyalty to both the monarchy and his wife, he faced a dilemma that few could imagine. On one hand, he had defended Meghan publicly, justifying her statements and framing them within a narrative of their struggles with media intrusion and institutional pressures. On the other hand, the Queen's letters made it evident that, privately, the family perceived those statements very differently. It was a collision of loyalty, emotion, and historical responsibility, and for Harry, the collision reportedly hit with the force of revelation. Meghan, too, reportedly felt the weight of this moment. For years, she had carefully constructed her public persona, managing the narrative of the couple's struggles, highlighting discrimination, isolation, and personal challenges within the palace walls. But the letters, read aloud in the room, challenged the very foundation of that narrative. For the first time, insiders say, she was confronted not with public criticism, but private critique from the family matriarch herself, a critique that carried legitimacy, history, and the authority of the monarchy. The realization that the Queen had not only observed but judged her actions with such clarity reportedly sent a shiver of apprehension through the room. The letters, sources indicate, went further than just addressing the interview. They allegedly dissected Meghan's intentions, highlighting moments the Queen considered manipulative or misleading. One passage reportedly emphasized the discrepancy between Meghan's self-perception and the reality observed by the family, framing it as a cautionary tale about public image versus private truth. For a couple who had built careers on careful media management, the irony was striking. The Queen, using the simplest tool, handwritten words, had exposed gaps in narrative control that no PR team could fix. Audience, let me ask you, have you ever had someone you trusted reveal their disappointment in a way so precise, so undeniable, that it left you questioning your own intentions? That, in essence, is what Harry and Meghan faced. The letters were not vague criticisms. They were deliberate, layered, and pointed assessments that required careful reflection. The Queen reportedly even referenced specific moments of public statements, framing them against private family experiences in a way that highlighted perceived inconsistencies and misrepresentations. The emotional intensity in the room reportedly escalated as William read aloud. Every word seemed to hang in the air, pressing down on the couple with the weight of history and consequence. Harry, known for his protective instincts, reportedly felt torn between defending Meghan and acknowledging the validity of the Queen's private judgments. Meghan, meanwhile, faced the rare and uncomfortable situation of being confronted with an authoritative critique she could neither rebut publicly nor privately without further scrutiny. The room, already thick with tension, became almost unbearable in its intensity. The Queen's letters, insiders say, also highlighted the personal impact of the interview on her own sense of family cohesion. She reportedly expressed disappointment not only in the content of the statements, but in the method of disclosure, framing the public airing of grievances as an unnecessary breach of trust. The phrasing was precise, measured, and cutting, a reflection of a woman who had mastered the art of diplomacy yet refused to compromise when it came to core family values. It was, by all accounts, a final assertion of authority and perspective from a monarch whose word had always carried weight. At one point, the Queen's observations reportedly drew attention to the contrast between the couple's narrative of isolation and the family's perception of availability and engagement. According to insiders, the letters suggested that opportunities for private dialogue and resolution had been ignored in favor of public exposure. The implication was stark. Meghan and Harry had chosen a path that amplified public scrutiny, yet the Queen's notes framed this choice as a misstep with both personal and historical consequences. The stakes were magnified by the fact that these letters were being read aloud in a room that, while private, was charged with centuries of tradition and expectation. The Queen had not written these words for the public. They were meant to be internal, a family reckoning preserved in ink. Yet, by reading them aloud, William transformed them from private reflection into a moment of public accountability, at least for those present. The irony, insiders note, was almost palpable. Meghan and Harry, whose careers have often revolved around shaping perception, were confronted with unfiltered truth in a setting that left no room for media spin or narrative control. Audience, consider this tension. What happens when private criticism carries the authority of history, family, and public expectation all at once? The Queen's letters were not casual notes. They were deliberate documents, designed to confront, reflect, and preserve legacy. For Harry and Meghan, it was a moment that reportedly redefined their understanding of consequence, reputation, and trust. The room reportedly remained still for several long moments after the reading, each person grappling with the implications. Staff, aides, and family members alike sensed the historical significance. What had begun as a routine reading of the will had transformed into a confrontation with legacy, judgment, and the raw emotional currents that defined family, even one as public and storied as the British monarchy. And yet, as heavy as this revelation was, insiders hint that it was only the beginning. The Queen had more to say, more critiques, and more warnings contained within subsequent passages and other documents. The first envelope revealed her anger and disappointment, but what remained, rumored to include directives on privileges, responsibilities, and public behavior, would reportedly shake the couple in ways even more profound. But what came next? The deeper private directives, more pointed commentary, and perhaps the Queen's most personal assessments, would reportedly push Harry and Meghan further than they had ever imagined. And when that next revelation was disclosed, it was said to leave both of them grappling with truths that would reverberate for years to come. Prince Harry had always been the son who straddled two worlds. The boy who grew up under the weight of a global spotlight, yet longed for a private, ordinary life. The man who sought to carve out his own identity while remaining tethered to centuries of family tradition and expectation. But that day, as William read aloud the Queen's letters from the sealed envelope, Harry's carefully balanced world reportedly began to collapse, piece by piece. The Queen's words, carried through William's measured voice, were precise, unwavering, and laden with the authority that only a matriarch could wield. Every phrase seemed to cut directly into Harry's conscience. The letters, according to insiders, did not merely express disappointment. They reflected the Queen's perception that trust had been broken, that the sanctity of family privacy had been violated, and that choices made by Harry and Meghan had repercussions far beyond what they could control. For Harry, hearing the woman he revered articulate such disapproval in her own words was a moment of profound emotional impact. The weight of those words reportedly manifested physically. Sources describe him shifting in his seat, jaw clenched, hands gripping the arms of his chair, as if bracing against an invisible blow. Harry's history of dealing with loss, grief, and media scrutiny had prepared him for public judgment, but nothing could have fully readied him for the personal, intimate condemnation now being delivered by the voice of his grandmother. The Queen's critique was surgical, dissecting not just actions, but intent, perception, and consequence. Audience, consider this. How would you feel if someone whose opinion has shaped your very life, whose guidance you have sought in moments of doubt, suddenly delivers a verdict that challenges your most deeply held beliefs about yourself and your choices? For Harry, The answer reportedly lay in a mixture of shock, sorrow, and the creeping awareness that this moment would redefine his relationship with both his family and the public. Insiders suggest that Harry's anguish was compounded by the recognition that the Queen's letters were not merely personal judgments. They were historical artifacts. Every word carried not just emotional weight, but the weight of legacy. The Queen had meticulously observed the couple's actions, recorded her thoughts, and preserved them for posterity. To be confronted with such deliberate, thoughtful assessment, in a room where the words were read aloud, was reportedly almost overwhelming. It was as if history itself had turned its gaze upon him, unflinching and unyielding. The Queen reportedly addressed Harry directly in her letters, reflecting on the consequences of the public narratives he had helped shape alongside Meghan. According to sources, she expressed a sense of disbelief that he had allowed private grievances to become public spectacles, framing this not as a personal attack, but as a matter of duty, legacy, and family integrity. For a man who had long grappled with the tension between personal freedom and royal obligation, these words reportedly cut deep. Harry's private anguish was reportedly magnified by the realization that the very actions he believed were justified, protecting his wife, asserting independence, shaping a public narrative, were viewed through a very different lens by the Queen. The letters suggested that the monarchy interpreted these actions as breaches of trust, misrepresentations, and departures from the code of conduct that had guided generations. For someone who had spent years navigating public perception, media scrutiny, and family expectations, the realization that his choices had been fundamentally misread by the matriarch of the family was reportedly devastating. Meghan's presence reportedly offered some support, but it was a fragile shield. While she remained composed outwardly, insiders suggest that Harry could sense her own tension, the subtle acknowledgement that the Queen's words were not easily countered. He reportedly felt torn between defending her and acknowledging the validity of the critique, a conflict that amplified his inner turmoil. The reading, intimate and private, forced Harry to confront questions he had long avoided. Had he protected his family at the cost of trust? Had he misjudged the consequences of public exposure? And, most importantly, could reconciliation ever truly occur under the weight of such precise judgment? Audience, ask yourself this. What would you do if someone you loved, someone whose guidance had always been your compass, suddenly told you in no uncertain terms that you had failed them? That is the crucible Harry faced. His public persona, built on a foundation of loyalty, courage, and advocacy, clashed violently with the private critique of a family he revered. The tension between image and reality, between intention and perception, reached a peak that day, an emotional crucible that insiders describe as both painful and transformative. The letters reportedly did not merely critique, they also reflected on the ripple effects of Harry's decisions. They highlighted the strain placed on family cohesion, the impact on siblings, and the consequences for legacy. Every action, every choice, was framed within the context of duty, history, and expectation. For Harry, this reframing was reportedly shocking, not because he disagreed with his grandmother's perspective, but because it crystallized the disconnect between his understanding of loyalty and the family's perception of obligation. As the reading continued, sources suggest that Harry's demeanor shifted between visible composure and subtle expressions of internal conflict. A tight jaw, a flicker of the eyes, a hand resting on the knee. All micro-expressions indicating a man grappling with profound emotional and psychological weight. The letters had succeeded in cutting through layers of media strategy, public narrative, and personal justification. In their raw honesty, they forced Harry to confront truths that he could not escape. The Queen's critique reportedly extended beyond public actions to private judgment. She addressed not only what had been said, but also how it had been said, and the consequences of choosing public exposure over private resolution. For someone like Harry, who had long been aware of the delicate balance between public expectation and private life, this was a moment of acute realization. Even his best intentions were interpreted through the lens of duty, history, and familial legacy. Every choice, every public statement, was now weighed against a standard that had been carefully cultivated over centuries. Audience, imagine the complexity of this emotional landscape: loyalty to a spouse, adherence to family legacy, and the internal compass of morality all colliding in a single, private moment. That was Harry's private anguish. And while Meghan's support was present, the reality of the Queen's critique reportedly created a chasm of tension that neither words of comfort nor strategic thinking could easily bridge. It was a confrontation with legacy, judgment, and the harsh reality that private words, once written, have enduring power. And yet, even amidst the weight of this personal reckoning, there was a sense of inevitability. The Queen's letters, carefully crafted and deliberately preserved, were not spontaneous outbursts. They were reflections of years of observation, experience, and measured judgment. Harry, for all his sensitivity and insight, could not avoid the impact of these words. They were a mirror, reflecting both his choices and the consequences of those choices in a light he could not manipulate or control. But as the letters concluded, insiders hint that the Queen's critique was only part of the story. There were additional passages, more pointed observations, and directives that would reportedly continue to challenge Harry's understanding of loyalty, duty, and family expectation. And when these subsequent revelations were read aloud, sources suggest that Harry's private anguish deepened further, pushing him to confront decisions and consequences in ways that would echo through the remainder of his life. The moment was quiet, yet charged with an intensity that seemed almost unbearable. Buckingham Palace, usually a symbol of control, tradition, and measured protocol, now felt like a crucible. All eyes were on Meghan Markle as Prince William continued reading aloud the Queen's letters. She had always been poised, her public image carefully curated, her composure near flawless even under intense scrutiny. But insiders report that the weight of the Queen's words, finally laid bare in the intimate, closed room, revealed a vulnerability she had never shown before. For years, Meghan had navigated a labyrinth of public expectations, media narratives, and palace protocol. She had cultivated an image of confidence, sophistication, and strength, often facing global criticism with a practiced calm. Yet, in this room, that calm reportedly began to falter. The letters were not simply critiques. They were direct, personal reflections from a grandmother who had watched, judged, and recorded her observations with precision. Each word was a scalpel, cutting through narrative and persona alike. Audience, imagine this. You have carefully built a public persona over years, defending your choices, shaping your story for the world, and then someone you deeply respect, and whose opinion you hold as law, reads aloud words that challenge everything you have presented. How do you respond? Meghan, sources say, responded with subtle but undeniable tension. Her hands, usually steady, reportedly fidgeted just enough to catch the attention of those who had long studied her demeanor. A brief tightening of the jaw, a fleeting narrowing of the eyes, a pause in her breathing. All micro-expressions signaling a breach in the carefully maintained composure that had become her armor. The letters reportedly dissected not only public statements, but also private behaviors. The Queen allegedly highlighted moments she viewed as manipulative or misleading, framing them against the backdrop of family expectations and historical precedent. For Meghan, who had invested so much in controlling perception and navigating the complexities of royal life, this confrontation was reportedly destabilizing. It was not merely criticism. It was a mirror reflecting choices, intentions, and consequences with unflinching clarity. Harry, seated beside her, reportedly tried to provide a shield, a quiet presence meant to buffer the impact. But the Queen's words were not just about him. They were pointedly about Meghan. According to insiders, the critique focused on actions, statements, and patterns of behavior that the Queen perceived as disruptive to family cohesion. In that moment, Meghan reportedly experienced a rare and profound vulnerability, a recognition that no amount of public defense, media strategy, or charisma could mitigate the personal weight of these private judgments. The room reportedly held a tension so thick it was almost tangible. Staff and aides, who had witnessed decades of palace protocol and family dynamics, described the scene as unlike anything they had ever experienced. The combination of history, authority, and personal critique created a scenario where every glance, every gesture, carried immense significance. Meghan's subtle signs of distress were amplified in this context, signaling to those present, and to Harry, that the Queen's words were having their intended effect. Audience, Consider this question. How do you maintain composure when someone whose opinion you value most not only disapproves, but does so in a manner that leaves no ambiguity? Meghan, sources suggest, faced this exact dilemma. Her public confidence collided with private critique, creating an internal struggle between defending herself and absorbing the weight of the Queen's words. Even someone as media-savvy and strategic as Meghan reportedly found the confrontation almost unbearable. The letters reportedly referenced specific moments from the Oprah interview, contrasting public statements with private truths known only to the family. The Queen allegedly described these statements as deliberately cruel and deeply false, a phrase that reportedly caused Meghan's subtle reactions of tension, flickers of doubt, and quiet internal recalibration. For the first time in this private gathering, the carefully constructed narrative Meghan had presented to the world faced an unfiltered assessment that could not be rebutted, spun, or softened. Insiders suggest that Meghan's trembling was not merely physical but emotional. The letters reportedly highlighted perceived inconsistencies, misrepresentations, and actions that the Queen viewed as breaches of trust. Meghan, who had long navigated scrutiny with poise, was confronted with a critique that was intimate, authoritative, and historically grounded. The result, sources say, was a visible struggle to maintain control while processing the gravity of the moment. The letters, read aloud by William, reportedly emphasized both the personal and historical consequences of the actions taken by Meghan and Harry. While her public persona often focused on advocacy, compassion, and resilience, the Queen's words reframed these choices through a lens of familial duty, historical precedent, and legacy. For Meghan, this reframing reportedly forced her to confront questions about her intentions, methods, and the long-term impact of her decisions within the royal family. Observers in the room reportedly noticed a subtle shift in Meghan's demeanor as the reading continued. Her posture, while outwardly composed, held traces of tension. Her hands, carefully folded in her lap at the start, reportedly shifted, fingers tightening briefly. Her breathing, usually steady and controlled, was noted to have brief irregularities. Every micro-expression, while nearly imperceptible to the untrained eye, indicated that Meghan was experiencing a level of emotional strain that few outside the palace could imagine. Audience, think about the stakes here. This was not public criticism or media speculation. These were private words from a family matriarch whose authority, judgment, and perspective carried centuries of weight. The letters were not mere admonishments. They were reflections on trust, loyalty, and the very essence of familial responsibility. Meghan, confronted with this reality, reportedly felt the full force of accountability in a way that no public engagement could replicate. Even as the letters continued, William's measured delivery reportedly maintained the room's solemn tone. Each pause, each inflection, allowed the words to settle, amplifying their impact. The letters were deliberate, precise, and layered, highlighting the contrast between public persona and private perception. For Meghan, this juxtaposition reportedly created a tension that was both deeply personal and historically significant. The realization that her narrative was being directly challenged in such a manner, in a room where every nuance mattered, reportedly contributed to a subtle yet unmistakable trembling, a sign of vulnerability in a person often perceived as impervious. According to insiders, Meghan's responses were largely internalized. There were no overt displays of confrontation or argument, only subtle gestures that indicated the emotional weight she was processing. A brief shift in her posture, the almost imperceptible tightening of her hands, and the fleeting flicker in her eyes all suggested a profound awareness of the Queen's private judgments. For someone accustomed to controlling narrative and perception, these private words reportedly carried a unique and piercing impact. Audience, ask yourself this. How would you respond if someone you respected implicitly, whose guidance shaped your life, articulated disappointment in such precise, undeniable terms? Meghan reportedly faced this very challenge, and insiders say it was one of the rare occasions where her public persona gave way to private vulnerability. The letters, read aloud in a room filled with family and aides, were more than critique. They were a confrontation with authority, history, and truth. The room remained quiet, the air thick with tension, as William reached the closing lines of the letter. Every word had carried weight, every phrase layered with meaning. The Queen's critique had been direct, personal, and historically informed. Meghan's trembling, subtle yet unmistakable, reportedly reflected the internal processing of this judgment, a moment where public image collided with private reality in a way that could not be avoided or deflected. And yet, the letters hinted at more. Sources suggest that the envelope contained additional passages, further observations, and directives that would continue to challenge Meghan, her decisions, and her public persona. What had been revealed so far was only the beginning, a prelude to deeper truths that would reportedly push her to confront both personal and historical consequences. But what came next? The Queen's most pointed warnings, the passages about legacy, privilege, and responsibility, would reportedly shake Meghan even further. And when these next revelations were read aloud, insiders say, the room would bear witness to a level of tension and emotion that no one in royal history had ever experienced in a single moment. The envelope itself was small, unassuming, yet it carried a weight far greater than its size suggested. Marked in the Queen's distinctive handwriting with the words, "For the family's eyes only." It had been sealed with the kind of care and precision that only someone who understood the gravity of legacy could master. To the casual observer, it might have appeared as just another piece of correspondence among many that passed through Buckingham Palace. But insiders stressed that this envelope was far from ordinary. It contained the Queen's final, private words regarding Meghan Markle and Prince Harry, words meant to address behavior, choices, and decisions that had reverberated throughout the family and the world. The secrecy surrounding the envelope had been maintained with meticulous attention. Only a handful of senior aides and Prince William himself were aware of its existence. It had been stored securely in the Queen's private study, a location few could access, even within the inner sanctum of palace staff. The very act of opening it, reading its contents aloud, and doing so in the presence of Harry and Meghan was an unprecedented moment in modern royal history. It was as if the weight of centuries of family tradition, expectation, and judgment had been condensed into a single piece of paper. As William carefully lifted the envelope, the room reportedly fell into an almost unbearable hush. The air was charged, not just with the anticipation of what the letters contained, but with the history they represented. Each of the family members present reportedly sensed the gravity of the moment. This was more than inheritance, more than property or title. This was the Queen's private verdict, expressed in her own words, on behavior she considered profoundly consequential. And as William began to unfold the paper, the room seemed to hold its breath. Audience, consider this. What does it feel like to hold a document in your hands that carries the weight of not just wealth or legacy, but judgment, authority, and history? For Harry and Meghan, the envelope represented a reckoning unlike any they had ever experienced. What lay within its folds would reportedly challenge perceptions, redefine relationships, and illuminate cracks in a carefully constructed public narrative. And yet, for all its significance, the envelope itself was almost deceptive in its simplicity. Inside, according to sources, were handwritten letters in the Queen's elegant, precise script. These letters were not impersonal or bureaucratic. They were intimate, direct, and carefully articulated. The Queen reportedly addressed specific behaviors, choices, and public statements made by Harry and Meghan, highlighting perceived inconsistencies between public persona and private action. The letters reportedly included references to the Oprah interview, with phrases like deliberately cruel and deeply false, appearing in a context that emphasized both personal disappointment and the broader consequences for family cohesion. Meghan's reaction to the envelope reportedly revealed a rare moment of vulnerability. For someone who had navigated public scrutiny with extraordinary poise, the confrontation with private critique was destabilizing. Insiders described subtle shifts in posture, a brief tightening of the hands, and fleeting expressions of apprehension, a combination of emotional processing and recognition that the Queen's words were not easily challenged. This was not public criticism that could be countered or spun. This was a private, historically anchored judgment, delivered in a room where every nuance was amplified. Harry, too, reportedly felt the full weight of the envelope's contents. Known for his loyalty and protective instincts, he was forced to confront the Queen's perspective not as rumor, speculation, or media narrative, but as tangible, deliberate, and authoritative critique. Sources suggest that he experienced a combination of shock, sorrow, and an acute awareness that the decisions he and Meghan had made, once removed from public spin, were being assessed through the lens of family legacy and historical expectation.